Hi guys, thanks for joining us today. My name is Evan Doty. I'll be presenting on this topic. So you're interested in Azure, now what? What led us to choose this topic for our webinar this month is that we have a lot of people who ask us, I'm interested in Azure, I've heard Microsoft talking about it, or I've seen advertisements on TV for it, or in the airport or whatever, and I don't know how I can get my business started with Azure. I don't know what I can do to step into it. What are most people doing, or what are some other people doing? Are they being successful? And so that's going to be sort of what we strive to answer. I'm going to, at a high level, I'm going to go over what Azure is and how it's licensed, what other businesses are doing in Azure, businesses that Dataprise works with. Why are they doing those things, and what benefits are they seeing come out of that? What does an organization need to know in order to get started using Azure? And also, what can you do if you need help with any of these steps along the way, or if you've accomplished or can accomplish these first things, what's next? And how do I get help on what's next? So that's going to be kind of the overview of what we're doing today. You'll notice that there is a Q&A window that's open. Please feel free to put questions in. I'll be answering any of those questions that come up at the end. And if it seems like the questions are going to go longer than our allotted hour, then myself or one of the other people at Dataprise will be reaching out to you to schedule up follow-up calls and that sort of thing. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So first of all, what is Azure? At a very basic level, and this is very basic, Azure is a cloud computing service for building, deploying, and managing applications and services through a global network of Microsoft managed data centers. So what does this actually mean? There are three basic components of this cloud service. The first one is infrastructure as a service. It's an instant computing infrastructure provisioned and managed over the internet, which is why it's a public cloud. It allows you to quickly scale up and scale down, and you only pay for what you use. Infrastructure as a service helps you avoid expense and complexity of buying and managing your own physical servers and other data center infrastructure. And you can think of it sort of as a hypervisor that Microsoft is providing for you that you are able to deploy your virtual infrastructure into. Microsoft manages that infrastructure, the cooling, the power, the internet connectivity, the failover for all of those different pieces. And you, as the user of their services, purchases, you install, configure, and manage your own software, operating systems, middleware, and applications. Platform as a service, the second of the three pieces that is offered in a cloud computing environment, is a development and deployment environment. And the resources there enable you to deliver everything from simple cloud-based applications to cloud-based apps for smartphones or whatever, to very sophisticated analytics or other cloud-enabled enterprise applications. In the instance of a platform as a service, you purchase the resources you need on a pay-as-you-go basis, and they allow you to avoid the expense and complexity of buying and managing licenses and the underlying application infrastructure, as well as middleware or some of the development tools. You simply manage the applications and services you develop, and the cloud service provider typically manages everything else. Software as a service, the third of these three categories within cloud computing, is basically, it's for end user, it's a direct end user connection. Your users can connect to and use cloud-based applications over the internet. Common examples are Office 365 with email and calendaring and Office tools, or Google, or Salesforce.com. Those are software as a service applications. SaaS application, software as a service, provides a complete software solution that you purchase on a pay-as-you-go basis from a cloud service provider. You rent the use of an application for your organization, and your users connect to it over the internet, generally with a web browser, sometimes with locally installed applications, again in the case of Office 365. And all of the underlying infrastructure, middleware, application software, and application data are located in the service provider's data center. So again, to differentiate these three, infrastructure as a service, you are renting the infrastructure, the metal, and you are paying for licensing. You're doing installation, configuration, and managing of your own software, operating systems, middleware, and applications. Platform as a service, the infrastructure and also the operating system and some of the middleware is provided by the cloud provider, and you're managing the applications and services that you're developing and deploying on top of that. And then software as a service, the cloud provider, in this case Microsoft or Azure, is providing everything, and you are simply consuming what they have provided on an ongoing basis. So I just wanted to look at this briefly because it is global. When Microsoft says we have a global presence, this is their current data center location map. There are 34 active locations. You can see right now there are 4 that are in progress, and that'll bring it up to a total of 38. The 4 in progress, 2 of them have to do with the EMEA and safe harbor stuff and kind of increasing all of that in the EU, in France Central and France South. The other 2 are US government for people who need ITAR compliance or some of those other specific compliances for US government or government contractors. And those will be coming online in the near future. So more specifically, when we're talking about Azure in particular, you know, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, software as a service, what do those mean inside Azure? What are the components of Azure in particular? Peter Drucker, the management guru, used to say, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And a key element of measuring and improving is analytics. So Azure provides analytics. Measure what's happening in your environment, measure how your users are consuming that, measure how your customers are consuming that, and then provide reporting and detailed statistics and analytics on that for you. Computing in Azure can range from virtual machines, Windows or Linux machines. It can include VM scale sets. Scale sets are groups of virtual machines that have predefined thresholds. And as a workload reaches a certain threshold of consumption on that machine, you know, processor is at 90% for more than 5 minutes, it will spin up another virtual machine inside that scale set, which means that you're not paying to run at maximum capacity all the time. You're paying for what your users or what your customers are consuming. Big data analysis engines running against a database backend is another piece of computing. You know, you want to run a very large analysis against a data warehouse or a data lake that you may have. You can put that computing infrastructure in the Azure cloud and take advantage of the elasticity, the ability to expand. And speaking of databases, that's another thing that can be provided within Azure. Databases can either be running on a virtual machine, SQL, Oracle, MySQL, etc., or as a platform offering where, again, you're just paying for the services and applications you're developing on top of the middleware, SQL, and the operating system infrastructure and the operating system and infrastructure that Microsoft is providing. Again, if you want to store data in a data warehouse, or even if you want to build a stretched repository or build a high availability group using Azure as one end of that availability group, those are all options for you. Mobile computing. Mobile can refer to Internet of Things. It can refer to mobile application development for web applications, for smartphones, for you know, tablet devices, whatever. It can include content delivery networks for hosting content in geographically relevant data centers. You know, if you have users who are in North America and in Australia and in the UK, and they need to download a video file or they're streaming something that they want to watch from your website, being able to have that geographically located close to that user means you're reducing latency and improving the end user's experience using your products. Excuse me. Networking. Networking starts with connectivity into the Azure environment. That can be either a virtual private network connection. It can be a BGP-based MPLS connection called ExpressRoute. It also includes DNS-based load balancing, VPN connectivity for individual users, application gateway for HTTP load balancing, again, for applications you have on your website, and then delivery control for users to your web content. Within storage, storage can contain blobs, binary large object storage containers, managed disks, data lakes, backup and site recovery, and StoreSimple, which is an appliance, an on-premise appliance that's designed for storage of unstructured data that you can leave on your premise. And it's kind of a three-tier SAN where you have a solid-state spinning disk and then the cloud is your third tier. And it moves stuff up into the cloud that you don't use and brings it back down when you do use it. It's actually pretty popular among law firms and other organizations that have large amounts of unstructured data. And then web. Web is application development, design, production, hosting, load balancing, media services. A lot of what I've talked about already, but then, you know, the actual production and deployment of websites as well. And this doesn't even cover some of the additional capabilities around intelligence and analytics, enterprise integrations, some advanced monitoring and management capabilities, and so forth. I mean, in short, there are hundreds of things that are happening in Azure at any given time, and that's literally expanding on a weekly or monthly basis. So I understand it's overwhelming. So the question really is, how can I make Azure useful to me and to my organization? So what are other businesses doing? You know, cage off of what people are already doing. Take advantage of that. Excuse me. So most often when we talk about Azure and first steps into Azure, our customers are looking at one of three things. The first thing that they're looking at is backup, VR, and business continuity. And within Azure, that's using Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery. If they're looking at backup, they're looking for a way to replace physical media backups, whether it's tape or optical media or some other form of fairly immutable storage that can be taken offline away from their primary premise, and it can be stored somewhere where they know it's going to be safe and retrievable, and they can keep it there for however long they're required to, either by law or by their internal practices. You know, some organizations like car dealerships, for instance, are required to keep their accounting books in perpetuity. So maintaining a storage location where they can do that is critical. Sometimes customers are looking for disaster recovery. And when they're looking for disaster recovery, it may be that they're already in a co-location facility or they're using an Amazon Web Services cloud already, and they're just looking for a different cloud hosting or different co-location facility where they can send their backups to that other location, just so that they are fully disparate networks storing their data and they're entirely offline. Alternately, a customer might be looking for an inexpensive, fast way to create a business continuity location, somewhere they can recover in the event of a business disrupting event that's going to leave them offline for a significant amount of time. So they need a site recovery service in order to do that, and that's Azure Site Recovery. So I'm going to go into those each a little bit more. And then we're also going to talk about identity and access management. That's the second thing our customers are looking at. How do I protect my much more mobile workforce? How do I make sure that users who are logging in are not are who they say they are, and I don't have a compromised user account that's on my network, it's accessing my environment, and how can I track that? And while all of that sounds good, how do I get started doing any of that? And then the last thing that people are asking for is infrastructure. And it seems like the most basic thing, but if you look at your organization right now, what we see, or when people come to us and ask about Azure for an infrastructure standpoint, they're saying, you know, our hardware is aging, it's out of warranty, and we don't want the capital expenditure of replacing servers and SANs and networking and all that sort of stuff for our entire organization. We want to try and limit that capital expense. Or it could be that, you know, we just bought a bunch of new hardware 2 years ago, we grew faster than we expected, we're out of capacity, and again, capital investments or simply time, we need more stuff faster than we can get hardware on site. Licensing is another issue. All of the major licensing providers, operating system providers, hypervisor providers have recently changed licensing models, and licensing is expensive and getting more expensive. And so by going to a cloud provider, they are able to purchase embedded licensing. And then With some people, it's just, we're interested in these sorts of things, but we want to try moving some of our non-critical infrastructure to see what kind of performance benefits or performance hits we take as we do that migration. So backup and disaster recovery. Let's start with that. Azure Backup is a backup solution that lets you basically take data, files, folders, and so forth, and make a copy of them and store them in Azure. That's the most basic level. Traditional backup solutions do just that. They treat the cloud as an endpoint or a static storage destination, and it's similar to disk or tape. It's simple, but it's limited and doesn't take full advantage of what the underlying cloud platform can do. So it ends up looking more expensive or more inefficient than otherwise it could be. So what does Azure Backup do, and why do our customers ask about it, and why do we end up deploying it with our customers? When we're configuring Azure Backup, we take advantage of some of the capabilities it has. For example, automatic storage management. Hybrid environments oftentimes require heterogeneous storage. But with Azure Backup, we don't need to do that. We don't charge, Microsoft doesn't charge for having an on-premise storage location using the Azure Backup agent. You can store it to a server on-premise as well as up to an Azure Recovery Services Vault. And it will automatically allocate that storage and prioritize it using a pay-as-you-use model. So you're only paying for the storage that you're using in Azure. It has unlimited scaling, so you can continue to increase the amount of data that you're putting there. You can have geo-redundant storage such that as you put more data into Azure, it's more protected, it's more geographically redundant, and it will continue to scale as you continue to put data there. You're not going to hit a cap. There are multiple storage options. I sort of alluded to locally redundant and geo-redundant previously. Locally redundant storage means that there are 3 copies of your data in one location, and there are 3 copies of your data in a paired data center in the same region. So, for example, in the US Azure East region, you'll have a copy of all of your data in US Azure East, and there will be 3 copies of it in the primary data center, and then the locally redundant piece of that will be 3 more copies of your data in another local data center in the Azure East region. Geo-redundant storage replicates your data to a secondary region. So again, using the example of US East, your geo-redundant location may be in US West or in Ireland or any other geographic location that you want to pick, and it creates 3 copies at your primary location. It creates 3 copies at a paired data center in the same region, and then it does that again in your geo region, 3 copies in your geo region, and then a second inside that same geographically located region, 3 more copies. So with geo-redundant storage, there are actually 12 copies of your data at any given time. Another advantage of using Azure Backup and why our customers are doing this is that it doesn't limit the amount of inbound or outbound data that you transfer. It also doesn't charge for data that's being transferred. The only way that you have to start paying for data is if you use the import-export service to seed your data. There is a cost associated with seeding a large amount of data. And we can kind of talk through that if you need help with looking at that stuff. Data encryption. You can store the encryption passphrase locally when you're encrypting your data within the Azure Backup agent. And as you're doing this local encryption and pushing everything up, because that passphrase is stored locally, Microsoft doesn't have any access to your data. They use TLS certificates, they use AES 256-bit encryption, and there just isn't a way to quickly or conveniently access any of your data. So even in the event that somebody malicious does manage to get through the Microsoft security that's in place and attempt to take a copy of your data, they still have to get through that last bit of security, and the passphrase is held in your system, not in the Microsoft systems. And then long-term retention. Instead of having to move copies from disk to tape and then tape to an offsite location, Azure can be used as short-term and long-term retention. There is no length of time limitation on a recovery service vault. You can keep data in the vault for as long as you like, and you can have up to 9,999 recovery points per protected instance. So, I have this image up here that shows kind of what that process looks like. If you're taking that Windows workstation or that server, or frankly any other kind of appliance or Linux environment or whatever that you want to back up, as it's grabbing that data, you can have you can go much further than father, grandfather, son, traditional typical backup methodologies, because it will store that 9,999 recovery points. And that's the current limitations on that. Azure Site Recovery. So there's a number of different models of Azure Site Recovery, and I'll talk about that one, the overall view of it first, and then I'll talk about some of these different models. So I'm leading here with a VMware to Azure architecture, because right now VMware is the leading player in the on-premise hypervisor space, and that's because it's a fantastic product. People use it, it's easy to use, it's easy to maintain and manage and set up and so forth, so that's why people are using it. What that doesn't mean is that it doesn't mean that you can't use Azure as your backup destination for site recovery. Excuse me for 1 minute. All right, sorry about that. So here's how site recovery can help with your business continuity or disaster recovery strategy. You can actually replicate full workloads running on a virtual machine or on a physical server, whether the virtual machine is in VMware or in HyperV, and you can replicate that to Azure rather than having to own a secondary site of your own. You can, the physical service can also be Windows or Linux. You can use site recovery services to actually migrate either on-premise instances to Azure virtual machines, to migrate Azure virtual machines between Azure regions. You can even do that to pull Amazon Web Services stuff over to Azure if you wanted to, using site recovery. You can deploy replication from a single location in the Azure portal, and you can run very simple failover and failback of single and multiple machines that are themselves non-impactful for your production environment. So you want to test failover and make sure that you're getting a live active copy of whatever you're backing up in Azure. You can run a test failover, you can spin it up in Azure, you can see how it's running, you can validate it, and then you can take it down, all without impacting your production environment. Application consistency. The machines that are being replicated using the process config servers that you see here, those machines that are being replicated are using application consistent snapshots. So in addition to capturing disk data, they're also capturing all data in memory and all transactions in process. So you're getting everything that's being brought up to the cloud. So if there is a failure, your RPOs and RTOs can be set very low and can be very fast. And speaking of that, site recovery can provide replication frequency as low as 30 seconds for HyperV and continuously for VMware. You can set RPOs, recovery point objective thresholds, to control how often those recovery points are created, and you can reduce that RTO by using an automated recovery process and integrations with the Azure Traffic Manager. The Azure Site Recovery can also integrate with other business continuity or disaster recovery technologies. For example, you can use site recovery to protect a SQL Server backend of a corporate workload, including built-in native support for the SQL Server Always On to manage failover of those availability groups so that you can move that across. And then there's also the ability to set up advanced network management in site recovery. So you can reserve IP addresses ahead of time, you can configure load balancers ahead of time, and you can integrate Azure Traffic Manager so that in the event of a DR event, you can fail over very quickly to Azure. So like I said, this is the first and most common instance of what we're seeing with our customers at Dataprise. We have VMware on premise, we want to have a cloud failover location. How do we do that? You can see that there's a process and a config server. And in a small environment, those can run on the same box. with larger servers or with higher deltas on an ongoing basis, we need to add additional process servers, because that's what actually caches, compresses, and encrypts the data before sending it to Azure. So that may need to scale out. And then there's a master target server that's used for failover, or for failback rather. And again, in a small environment, you may have, that may be a total of 2 virtual machines running in your VMware environment, one for process and config and one for the master target server. We run the mobility service on each one of your machines, physical or virtual, that you're backing up. And then in the event of a failover, we can fail over into Azure, run in Azure, and then fail back to your VMware infrastructure in the event that that needs to occur. The second environment that we see, and this is often with our larger customers, for example, we have a union in New York that has a VMware infrastructure that's near their headquarters in Manhattan, and they have a second VMware infrastructure that's in a data center that's located in New Jersey. And because those are geographically rather close together, they were looking for some solution that was going to provide a geographically redundant solution without having to buy a third data center or to provide a third data center's worth of storage somewhere out of the Atlantic Northeast. And so we talked to them about Azure Site Recovery, and that's the direction they've chosen to go. There's a master target and a config server, as well as process servers that are running as necessary. And at that point, with the mobility service running on all the VMs that we're backing up, basically what ends up happening is, they're using the typical replication channels in place until we move everything to running through Azure. Azure, the process server is moving everything across and downloading. It's using the Azure, which you can see here, the Azure Site Recovery Scout data channel to move that data between the 2 sites, in the event that they're not going to process through Azure. But it gives you that third failover location. What we're also starting to see, of course, is HyperV. And within HyperV, if you're going from an on-premise environment to Azure, there are 2 ways that we see HyperV occurring. Oftentimes, somebody has a single virtual host, a single HyperV host, and they want to go to Azure. And because they have a single host, they may not have invested in System Center Virtual Machine Manager. And so it's possible to set that up and configure that. I mean, the tools, of course, are much more native and much more easy to configure. But we can set that up from a single host, or if they have multiple hosts, or if they have Virtual Machine Manager, it gives us just a different set of tools to use, but the same process can happen where we can go from your on-premise virtual machines to Azure. And then, of course, Hyper-V to Hyper-V via Azure. In this case, we're replicating across a LAN or a VPN between the 2 sites, and then we're also replicating everything up into Azure Site Recovery in the event of an actual failover event, rather. But because, starting with Azure Backup and starting with the simplicity of configuring that and just having basically a cloud-based better than disk or better than tape location that provides that same functionality and then some, that's what our users are starting to, or our customers are starting to look at first is, I want to replace this aging tape backup solution I have, or I want to start taking data snapshots and putting them somewhere else. And it's easy, it's pretty inexpensive, and it's something that can be set up quickly. So the second thing that I talked about that our users are asking about is identity and access management. So with identity and access management, this oftentimes follows pretty closely off of an Office 365 migration. And the reason that this follows off an Office 365 migration or implementation is because Office 365 running behind it is actually using Azure Active Directory Basic to provide access for the users of the environment to log in. That's how it's storing the email addresses and how it's interfacing with Exchange and all that. So customers say, I want to use the same username and password that I'm using on-premise as I'm using in Office 365. So we'll set up either Azure Active Directory Connect, and it will create a synchronization in place between on-premise and the Azure AD backend, or we'll set up Azure Active Directory federation services, if they have requirements for more centralized control, they have more users or they have more locations, and they want to be able to have a little more fine control. The downside of using Azure or of using Active Directory Federation Services, ADFS, is that in an ADFS environment, if at any point you lose the connection between your premise and your cloud environment that's relying on ADFS, you lose access to be able to log on and authenticate because you're not caching those passwords. So every time somebody logs in, it's requesting a token from your on-premise environment. So when we do that, we will oftentimes set up an Active Directory and an ADFS server in Azure, and we will connect the Azure environment via VPN back to their premise and have Office 365 authenticating against the Azure instances of their Active Directory and the Federation servers, so that in the event that they lose access to their premise, they can still go to Starbucks. Azure is still up and running, Office 365 is still up and running, and they still have access and connectivity between those two. This is that first toe in the water, because you get to leverage the advantages of the cloud, high availability, geo-redundancy, etc., while also taking advantage of those integrations for Active Directory. Once an organization has an Active Directory server running in Azure, and they see how easy it is to connect and use that same single point of logon and authentication within Azure, they say, well, I want to use the same, I want to leverage that so that I can have my users log into Salesforce or into Dropbox or into Box or into, whatever the case might be with that same username and password. Can you help me set that up, or can you show me what that looks like? And the answer is sure, of course we can. The licensing is a little different in this case. The licensing is for Azure Active Directory Premium. And what Active Directory Premium essentially does is it acts, and this is a simplified description of it, but it's essentially acting as an edge proxy server for all of that authentication stuff. There are integrations into 2,700 plus popular SaaS applications. You can see some of them here: Google, Salesforce, Office 365, Box, Dropbox. But what's also useful is if you have custom applications, that Azure Active Directory Premium has an open API. And if you're using a Java authentication, or if you're using OAuth 2.0, or if you're using simple SAML authentication, all of those can be tied into Azure. So if you're developing your own applications and you want to have single sign-on into your own applications, you can provide that via that Active Directory Premium. And again, because we already have Active Directory running in Azure, because we already have an ADFS connection to an Azure Active Directory instance, in this case, turning this on is a matter of enabling a license and then connecting it to the software applications, the SaaS applications that users are looking for. Also within identity and authentication, once a user or once an organization has Azure Active Directory configured and up and running, once they have single sign-on up and running, they say, you know what, I also want to turn on multi-factor authentication for all of my different SaaS applications that I'm now logging into with a single set of credentials. I want to add that extra layer of security. And I actually saw a demonstration from Steve Deming, one of the Microsoft technical people in the DMV area, and it was a great presentation. He stands up in front and he tells everybody, I'm going to log into my sample Office 365 account, and you can see my email address, and he types in the email address for his demo account, and he says, and here's my password, and he tells everybody his password. And he usually waits about a minute or two to see if anybody tries to log in ahead of him, and he'll start getting text messages on his phone, and it says, so even though you have my password, you don't have my phone, which is my second factor of authentication. And enabling multi-factor authentication, again, is very easy. From a multi-factor standpoint, once you have that Azure Active Directory Premium license, enabling multi-factor authentication and setting it up so that your users have either the option or the requirement to use multi-factor authentication is just a couple of checkboxes inside the Azure portal. And it's pretty easy. Once it's installed and up and running, there's a couple of different extra benefits beyond simply using multi-factor. For example, Well, first of all, using multi-factor, the tokens can be either text messages or they can use a tokening app if you have an app on your phone that you prefer. They can also integrate into third-party systems like RSA or anything that's using an OAuth-based token, or if you have a CAC card that you want to use, or so on and so forth. We've configured all of that for our customers. It's very easy. It's very simple to implement, and when it's up and running, there's some secondary benefits that they can start taking advantage of. So you see here in the actions sections where it says allow access or enforce MFA on a per user or per app basis. On the back end, Microsoft's using machine learning and analytics to look at how your user behaviors are functioning. So let's say that I'm in the office and I get here at 9 in the morning and I log in and I use multi-factor to log into my machine and I'm working on my Windows 10 machine, and then I lock it and I go get some coffee or I go get a soda, and then I come back and I open it up again, and I don't have to multi-factor because it recognizes the same IP address, same geolocation, etc. So it lets me back in. But in that same period of time, let's say that I decided to go to Starbucks and work. I close my laptop, I take it to Starbucks, I open my laptop at Starbucks, new IP address, new location, it's a Starbucks, one of the Starbucks subnets. It's going to say, you know what, this could have been stolen and somebody's trying to access it, whatever. I'm going to require you to multi-factor in, even though the same amount of time may have passed in each instance. It may also just say, I'm going to block access to these applications because you're now attempting to log on from San Francisco, and 10 minutes ago you were logging in from the DC area. So that seems like it's not appropriate. I'm going to lock it and I'm going to alert your administrator. So configuring all of this, setting all of this up, we can help with all of this if you need that. But that's what our users are asking for. They're asking us for setting up a single authentication process for their users once they've started using something like Office 365 or another cloud-based product. Then they're asking for single sign-on, and then they're asking for multi-factor authentication. So then the last thing that I said I was going to talk about was infrastructure and licensing. And infrastructure and licensing, I'm going to talk about these kind of concurrently because you can see how the infrastructure itself is licensed and how you pay for it at the same time as we kind of talk about how people are using infrastructure. And this is why people are using infrastructure in Azure and in other public cloud environments. So first of all, what are the two key points of Azure licensing? The first one is there aren't any upfront costs. You can, and I'll show you an example in just a minute, you can log into Azure. You can create an account in Azure. It doesn't cost you anything. You can even have that account and click through stuff and see what's available and all of that. It won't cost you anything to just look through it. There's no upfront costs. And there are no termination fees. So let's say that you do spin up a server, you run it for 20 minutes or half an hour, or whatever, and you're still within that Azure free credit window, and you decide, you know what, I'm going to cancel that. I don't want to use it anymore. Or let's say that you paid for it, you've spent, $7 running a virtual machine for 3 or 4 days, and you're going to stop running that virtual machine. There isn't a minimum. It's not a, you must run this for a month, we're going to charge you for a month. It's just when you stop using it, you stop paying for it. That's all there is to it. So what does this look like? So basically, creating this free account in Azure, I put some screenshots up here of doing this so you could see what it looks like and see what that process is. So starting here, you go to the Azure website, azure.microsoft.com, and you can click on the free account, and it takes you here. You say create your free account. You get $200 in credit. You can try any of the services. You don't pay anything. They will ask for a credit card, but that's simply for identity verification to make sure you're not a bot, to make sure you're an actual person, and you can log in and it's just fine. I actually forgot to capture the next screen after I click Start Free. If you have an existing account, you can use that. If you need to create a new account, you can do that as well. For demo accounts, if you're just trying it out, I recommend creating a new Microsoft account, Outlook.com or whatever, so that you're not doing anything that you might want to use for a production account in the future. So here's the logon. Oh, I guess I did take screenshots of this. Okay. So you create the Microsoft account. It takes you to this screen. This is the first page of the actual Azure sign-up screen versus the Microsoft sign-up screen. So I filled all this out. I did my identity verification by phone. I put in my credit card, and now I'm skipping to the end. And you can see up here at the top, emd-demo@outlook.com. That was the demo account that I created, the demo Microsoft account. So I get to the end. It says agreement. Yes, I agree to the subscription agreement. I'm not going to make any bots. I'm not going to, create any viruses and distribute them via Azure and so forth. It will ask you, like I said, for a valid phone number and a credit card. But this is just to ensure that you aren't a bot. Like I said, you can set the maximum billing on this. So at the end of the first month, it's not going to charge you anything. It just pushes pause on that. It doesn't automatically upgrade to a paid subscription. But if you do choose to continue with this account, you can actually set the maximum billing to 0, and then you won't be able to spin anything up. It will stay at 0. Yeah, like I said, pay as you go. You don't pay for anything you're not using. $200 credit, no commitment, and that's all there is to it. So I signed up for it. I said, yes, I accept the stuff, the terms and conditions, and now the account is created. So when you log in, this is what your Azure Dashboard actually looks like. This is, right now I have no resources set up to display. You can see the service health window shows all of the geographical regions that are live, just like we looked at before. On the left-hand side is all of the different options of things you can sign up for: databases, data warehouses, virtual machines, load balancers, storage accounts, Azure Active Directory, and so forth. So, no upfront costs, no termination costs, just like we talked about. So, pay only for what you use, and per minute billing. So, what I want to do is I want to use an actual concrete example of this. Acme Computer Corp has decided to use our example from before, spinning up an Azure Active Directory server running in Azure. They've selected this D1 instance to run. This screenshot was taken from Azure West, just to show you that there are different regions that you can select from that are geographically relevant to you. I'm going to build the machine in Azure East 2, I think. But here they're saying that the estimated cost to run this for a month is $104.16 with 744 hours of runtime. That's a 24/7, 365 machine. What this actually means in terms of billing is that it costs about 14 cents an hour, or about 0.0023 cents per minute, which is the increment that Microsoft bills at. It's per minute billing. So if you run this machine for, let's say, 15 days, 7 hours, and 26 minutes, and then they say, you know what, we need a larger instance for Active Directory. Too many people are logging in at once. Or we're just not using this, we're going to shut it down entirely, whatever. So they shut this machine down. 15 days, 7 hours, and 26 minutes is 367 hours and 26 minutes, or 21,626 minutes. I don't get to do enough math in my job, so sometimes I like to do this stuff. So at 0.002 cents per minute in this month, the server cost them, with rounding, $50, $50.61. For an example of spinning up, or for an ability to spin up a virtual machine and see if it's going to work, $50 is a pretty low cost considering what it would have been to purchase even a small enterprise-grade server for their environment on their premise or in their colo or whatever. So let's create that D1 machine and see what it actually looks like. I'm back here in my Azure portal. I click on New because I'm going to create a new resource within Azure. After I click on New, I'm going to select Compute, and then I'm going to select a Windows Server 2016 Data Center instance. You can see here just by looking at this that I have other options. I can create a Red Hat server. Let's say I wanted to do LDAP instead of Active Directory for my authentications, or if I was going to build a Chef server or something else that I wanted to run in Red Hat or Ubuntu. I could even use a Server 2012 if I had application requirements that mandated using a 2012 instance. And then there's more that, if I were scrolling down, if this were a live screen, there's a bunch of other options down here as well. So I select the 2016 data center instance. this is what it pops up with. It says select a deployment model, Resource Manager, or Classic. Resource Manager is going to provide some additional options for future deployments, for scripting your deployments, for integration into a Chef or a Puppet instance, for a bunch of other reasons. So generally, we recommend at Dataprise using the Resource Manager model. We can go into that further if you would like. So once I click OK on that, configure the basic settings for this. The basic setting for name, for the disk type, what my username is going to be, password, all of that stuff. And because I don't have anything, I have to create everything new. I have to create a new resource group. I have to create everything new. So I do that. And I'm going to name this the Azure W Demo for our webinar that we're having right now. The disk type I select is a hard disk, a spinning disk instead of solid state. My username is admin-demo. My password is ... And I've created a new resource group called the Azure W Demo resource group. You can see here the location that I'm spinning this up in is US East 2, as I said. So the next step is you choose what size. It'll always populate 3 sizes for you by default. In this case, it's showing me D1, D1 V2, or A1. I'm selecting D1 because that's what we talked about before. You can also click View All, the little blue writing just above the A1 standard. And when you say View All, it's going to show all of the different possible virtual machine sizes that Microsoft has running right now, from what we're looking at here on the smaller end all the way up to 56 cores and half a terabyte of RAM and all this other crazy capabilities. If you're doing that kind of high processing, highly intensive compute builds, those are also going to be more than $96 a month to run. So once I've gone through and I've set everything up, you can look on the left-hand side and you can see all of the configurations. Most of these are pretty automatic. It selects these for me. It says my virtual network is going to be called the Azure W Demo Resource Group VNet. It's going to use a default subnet, the 10.000. It's going to use a public IP address. Now, the public IP address that's being issued with, every virtual machine is issued with a public IP address, but it's not a static IP address. If you shut down the machine or if you restart the machine, it will maintain that reservation. If you completely turn off the machine, it may release that reservation and you'll have a different IP address. You can select a reserved IP if you choose, in which case it won't ever lose that. I also scrolled down so you can see what's below high availability here. I did not set up a high availability set. I enabled boot diagnostics for monitoring. I did not enable the guest OS diagnostics. Again, this is mostly a default build. And then I clicked OK. It says, OK, here's what we picked. Here's all the stuff. Are you sure this is what you want? And if you look up at the top where it says Microsoft Azure and then New Compute Windows Server 2016 Data Center Create Virtual Machine Summary, each one of those along the top is a breadcrumb that I can click back to and I can say, you know what? I don't actually want a 2016 data center. I want something different. And start this over just by clicking that breadcrumb. In this case, though, I clicked OK. You can also see here where it says download templates and parameters. Again, for Puppet or Chef or another automated deployment methodology, that's what you would use, is that download templates and parameters. So I click OK. And now you can see at 8:57 a.m., I've started initializing the deployment of my virtual machine. You can see, again, there are no resources in all of my subscriptions on the left, no resources. And it says submitting deployment for Windows Server 2016. When I click on that deployment, it's showing me the deployment date, 8:57:34. Status deploying, duration has been 1 second. And it's going through the process of deploying that server. When I click back over, you can now see that the virtual machine is up and running in the right-hand corner. And this section that I've highlighted in red here shows all the various resources that were created as part of spinning up this virtual machine. There's the W Demo VM. There's the virtual network that was set up, the network interface that was created and attached, public IP address, the network security group, which is a firewall that runs, software firewall. And then the storage account that I created for Azure W Demo storage is for the actual storage disks on the virtual machine, and then the diagnostics is a logging and diagnostic storage account. So it's up and running. The other thing is when I click in and look at it, take a look at this, the details of that virtual machine. Take a look in the bottom right-hand corner. It's 9:04. It's been about 7 minutes since I started the deployment, and I have a virtual machine up and running. The section that I've highlighted with the red bar shows the connect, start, restart, stop, and delete. What we're looking at here is basically the hypervisor control screen for this virtual machine. And we can click connect and click into the virtual machine and land on its actual operating system desktop if we so choose, which we do. So we click on connect, an RDP window requesting authorization pops up, followed by an authentication window. You have to remember the username that you created before, admin-demo in this case, and the password, and the name of the server, because it's going to try and initially log you in like Windows does with your local account, whether it's a local or a domain account that you're logged into your machine with. So you're going to want to change it to Azure W Demo, WAC, admin-demo in this case, or whatever it is for you, because you're going to need to remember that to log in as a local admin to the machine. Right now, that machine isn't domain joined, it's just a raw, brand new server. So here we click connect on the RDP window, and that's it. We're now on a dashboard of a brand new virtual machine that's just been spun up and that's running, and we're off to the races. Total time for me to create this virtual machine was about 20 minutes, start to finish, and that actually included me having to go find my wallet for the verification credit card. It was not where I had expected it to be. So, you know, we've talked about infrastructure, we've talked about backups, we've talked about identity and access management. So now, what do I need to know to get started? That's the next really critical question. When I'm talking to customers and they're saying, you know, actually now that you've told me these things, this sounds pretty simple, it sounds like something I can do, but which one should I start with? These are the things that I always talk to them about. I say, what are your biggest risks right now? Is it in backup, disaster recovery, or business continuity planning? Do you have valid, verified backups that you can point to? Do you have a business continuity plan that you can point to that says, in the event that our main office goes down or our main infrastructure goes down, here are the steps necessary to get everything back up and running? And if you don't have that, how much will it cost you to be down? We have one customer who's a construction firm, and they actually go out and they build stuff. And if their server goes down, it's inconvenient for them, but they make their money by having people swing a hammer at a bunch of nails, and it's not going to be a huge impact for them. So for them, this wasn't the most critical point for them. In their case, it was a complex and sprawling identity management scope. They had web-based applications that they used for project management. They had internal applications that they used for inventory. They had a third application that was used to tie the inventory into their accounting and finance. They had a different system that was used for accounts payable than from accounts receivable. They had a bunch of different places where people had to log in and do stuff, and a lot of those users were not ever in their main office. They were out in the field. They were working from iPads or laptops in their truck on a work site. And so putting some boundaries around that and controlling that and making sure that they were enforcing the appropriate security was, to them, their biggest risk. And it could be that in your infrastructure or your environment, your aging infrastructure or your overutilized or your overcapacity infrastructure is going to be your biggest risk. And the second question you have to ask yourself when you're deciding how you're going to get started is, how do I leverage Azure to mitigate that risk? So let's say that you do have aging infrastructure. We can help you put together an ROI plan or a total cost of ownership plan of buying new stuff versus moving into Azure and seeing what that cost looks like. And then, of course, if you want help with any of these things, how can you get help? So a little bit about Dataprise at this point. Dataprise is glad to help you out. We have core coverage from New York to Georgia and over into Tennessee. And we have a consultant network in 30+ major US cities. I used to joke that it was the NFL cities plus Los Angeles, but now I guess I have to say it's the NFL cities plus St. Louis. and soon, for Oakland. But anyway, we are a leading managed services provider. We're regionally based. We do have that national reach. We are ranked on, I think, the number 12 MSP in the nation by MSP Mentor, which is our trade organization journal and organizational organization. We were founded in 1995, privately held. Headquarters are in Rockville, Maryland, right outside Washington, D.C. And we have Microsoft Solutions Consulting, we have managed services, we have enterprise information technology management capabilities, and we've had all of that for the last 2 decades. And we are extremely service and process focused and are glad to help you with any of the stuff that we've talked about or even expanding beyond that. So how do I get in contact with Dataprise, or how do you get in contact with Dataprise? These guys are your primary points of contact. They will engage other resources as necessary or as is appropriate. Roger Strizik, our Enterprise Account Executive covering the Mid-Atlantic. Kevin Killian, our Enterprise Account Executive in the Northeast. And Long Tran, our Business Development Manager for Heartland. Here's their emails and their contact information. And this deck is going to be published on our website, so you'll have access to this and to their contact information after this slideshow. So thank you again, and have a wonderful afternoon.